The man who has been at the center of so many national headlines was here in Norfolk. William & Mary alum and former director of the FBI, James Comey, spoke at Chrysler Hall as part of the Norfolk Forum series. Robert Boyd tells us Comey did not shy away from talking about some of the controversial topics in politics right now.
Well, James Comey spoke about a number of topics tonight, from his first job stocking groceries to getting fired as FBI director. We spoke with people who attended the event about why it was important to be here.
It's current. It is something we need to be following.
I think James Comey is a very important figure in American history.
I think we come here looking to be updated from somebody who was in the middle of it.
James Comey stood center stage in front of a nearly filled Chrysler Hall Tuesday night. His #1 message was leadership. He spoke about strong leaders in his own life, as well as the leadership he tried to portray as head of the FBI.
I think it's cool that guys like that come to Norfolk and come to the forum so that we have an opportunity to hear them.
But what many in attendance were most interested in was our ongoing political turmoil.
Events that led up to the Russia investigation, the events that led up to his firing, and how we can uphold democracy in this country.
Comey fielded a number of questions from the audience, including why he chose to reopen the Hillary Clinton email investigation days before the election, what is the future of Rod Rosenstein, and whether or not the FBI should investigate Supreme Court nominee Brett Kavanaugh.
His opinion on where the United States' moral direction needs to go can be very interesting.
Colin Fogarty was among a group of First Colonial High School students in attendance who actually got to meet Comey.
And I think it's super important, especially with midterms right around the corner, to understand what happened in the last election.
And of course, James Comey not exactly leaving the Hampton Roads community. He will be returning to William & Mary to teach select courses. In Norfolk, Robert Boyd, 13 News Now.